Rain had been falling steadily for 3 days straight, turning the usually pristine grounds of Fort Henderson into a muddy expanse that reflected the gray November sky. Staff Sergeant Martinez was completing his routine perimeter check when he first spotted her through the chain-link fence that bordered the eastern edge of the military base. She appeared to be in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with silver-streaked hair that hung in wet tangles around her weathered face. Her clothes were layers upon layers of mismatched fabric, a faded military surplus jacket over what looked like a hospital gown, torn jeans beneath a long skirt, and boots that had seen better decades. What struck Martinez most wasn't her disheveled appearance, but the way she moved. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the heavy limp that favored her left leg, there was something unmistakably purposeful about her stride. She wasn't wandering aimlessly like many of the homeless individuals, who occasionally found their way near the base seeking shelter. This woman was walking with determination, as if she knew exactly where she was going. The security cameras had been tracking her approach for the better part of an hour as she made her way along the access road. She had paused several times, not from fatigue as the guards initially assumed, but to study the layout of the base with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. Her eyes, even from a distance, seemed to be cataloging every detail: the guard positions, the vehicle checkpoints, the blind spots in their surveillance coverage. When she finally reached the main gate, the guards were already on high alert. Master Sergeant Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had served in 3 combat zones, felt his hand instinctively move toward his sidearm as she approached. There was something about her that triggered every instinct he had developed over 2 decades of military service. She wasn't just another vagrant looking for help. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who belonged in their world, even wrapped in the tattered remnants of civilian life. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military installation," Thompson called out through the reinforced glass of the guard booth. "You'll need to turn around and head back to the main road." The woman stopped about 10 feet from the gate and looked directly at him. For a moment, Thompson felt as if she was seeing straight through him, evaluating not just his words but his training, his experience, his very soul. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to her bedraggled appearance. "Sergeant, I need to speak with Colonel Harrison. Tell him that Ghost Rider is requesting permission to come home." The words hit Thompson like a physical blow. Ghost Rider wasn't just any call sign. It was legend within certain circles of the military community. Stories of Ghost Rider's operations had been whispered in barracks and briefing rooms for over a decade, always in hushed tones, always with a mixture of respect and disbelief. If even half the stories were true, Ghost Rider had been involved in some of the most classified and dangerous missions the military had ever undertaken. But Ghost Rider was supposed to be dead. Had been declared dead 5 years ago after a mission that officially never happened in a country that the United States had never officially entered. The memorial service had been closed casket, attended only by a handful of officers with security clearances so high they made Thompson's head spin. As Thompson stared at this broken woman standing in the rain, claiming to be a person who was supposed to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, he felt the carefully ordered world of military protocol beginning to fracture around him. The rational part of his mind said this was impossible. Just another mentally ill individual who had somehow learned classified information. But something deeper, something that had kept him alive through multiple deployments, was screaming that he needed to take this seriously. The woman seemed to sense his internal struggle. She reached slowly into the depths of her layered clothing, moving with deliberate care to avoid startling the increasingly nervous guards. What she withdrew was a small, tarnished piece of metal, a challenge coin that Thompson recognized immediately. It was the unofficial insignia of Task Force Prometheus, a unit so classified that officially it had never existed. "Check the biometric database," she said quietly, extending her right hand toward the scanner that was built into the gate mechanism. Authorization code Lazarus 77 Alpha. Thompson's hands were shaking as he activated the scanner. Lazarus. Codes were used for the most extreme circumstances, when operatives needed to return from deep cover assignments that had gone catastrophically wrong. He had heard of them, but never actually seen one used. The scanner hummed to life, casting an eerie blue glow over the woman's palm as it read the unique pattern of her fingerprints. What happened next would haunt Thompson for the rest of his career. The scanner didn't just confirm the woman's identity. It triggered a cascade of automated protocols that began flashing across his monitor in urgent red text. Within seconds, alert signals were being transmitted directly to the Pentagon, to SOCOM headquarters, and to a dozen other agencies whose acronyms Thompson didn't even recognize. The woman standing before him wasn't just claiming to be Ghost Rider. According to the biometric database, she was Major Sarah Chen, recipient of 2 Purple Hearts, 3 Bronze Stars, and decorations from allied nations that were still classified. She had been the tip of the spear for operations that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil, dismantled weapons trafficking networks, and eliminated threats that the public would never know existed. And for the past 5 years, while the military mourned her death and honored her memory, Sarah Chen had been living on the streets of American cities, forgotten and alone, struggling with injuries both visible and invisible that had been the price of her service to a country that believed she was dead. As the gate began to slowly swing open and emergency protocols activated throughout the base, Thompson realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in military history. This wasn't just the return of a lost soldier. This was the resurrection of a ghost, and none of them were prepared for what that might mean. Within 7 minutes of the biometric confirmation, Fort Henderson had transformed from a sleepy administrative base into the epicenter of a crisis that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Colonel Harrison's secure phone had been ringing non-stop since the Lazarus alert triggered, and each conversation seemed to leave him more shaken than the last. The colonel, a man who had weathered 3 tours in Afghanistan without losing his composure, found himself pacing his office like a caged animal as he tried to process what his security team was telling him. The woman they had brought to conference, Room Delta, the most secure interrogation facility on the base, wasn't just Sarah Chen. According to the classified files that were now flooding his secure terminal, she was the cornerstone of an operation so sensitive that even he, despite his security clearance, was only being granted partial access to her file. What he could read made his blood run cold. Major Sarah Chen had been the lead operative in Operation Nightfall, a 3-year deep cover mission that had taken her into the heart of an international arms trafficking network. She had lived among criminals, terrorists, and war profiteers, becoming one of them so completely that even her handlers had sometimes questioned which side she was really on. The psychological evaluation reports from her periodic check-ins painted a picture of a brilliant mind slowly fracturing under the impossible pressure of maintaining multiple identities while witnessing atrocities she couldn't prevent without blowing her cover. The mission had been a stunning success, until it wasn't. 5 years ago, Chen had been extracted from a collapsed operation in a country that didn't officially exist on any map the public would ever see. The extraction had gone wrong in ways that were still heavily redacted in the files. Her transport had been shot down, and in the chaos that followed, Sarah Chen had simply vanished. Search and rescue operations had found blood, torn clothing, and enough evidence to conclude that she couldn't have survived. The military had honored her sacrifice, buried an empty coffin, and sealed her record so deeply that most people who knew her name were forbidden from ever speaking it again. But here she sat, very much alive, in a sterile room lit by harsh fluorescent lights, quietly sipping from a cup of coffee that she held with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The medical team that had examined her during processing had delivered a report that Harrison was still struggling to comprehend. She bore the physical evidence of 5 years of unimaginable hardship, malnutrition, untreated injuries, exposure damage, and surgical scars that suggested someone had tried to alter her appearance. More disturbing were the psychological evaluation. Notes that described a fragmented personality structure consistent with prolonged trauma and possible deliberate conditioning. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the base psychiatrist who had been hastily cleared for this unprecedented consultation, sat across from Chen with a mixture of professional fascination and human horror. She had treated soldiers returning from the worst. Combat zones had helped rebuild minds shattered by PTSD and moral injury, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. The woman before her spoke in perfect, measured sentences, but her responses contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested multiple overlapping identities struggling for control. "Major Chen," Dr. Warren said gently, "can you tell us what you remember about the night your transport was hit?" Sarah's eyes, which had been focused on some invisible point on the wall, suddenly snapped to meet the doctor's gaze. For just an instant, Warren saw something flicker across her face. Not confusion or pain, but something that looked almost like calculation. It was there and gone so quickly that Warren almost doubted she had seen it. "I remember the sound," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hollow quality that made everyone in the room lean forward unconsciously. "Not the explosion. I remember the sound the rain made on the metal roof of the compound where they kept us. Drip, drip, drip. For 18 months that was the only way I could measure time passing." Colonel Harrison felt his stomach drop. The official reports had stated that Chen's transport was shot down during extraction. There had been no mention of any compound, no indication that she had been captured rather than killed. He glanced at the secure tablet in his hands, scrolling frantically through the classified documents, searching for any reference to 18 months of captivity. "Major, the records indicate that your transport was shot down on March 15th, 5 years ago. Are you saying you survived the crash and were taken prisoner?" Harrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to show his cards until he understood the game being played. Sarah's laugh was a sound devoid of any humor, echoing strangely in the concrete room. "Colonel, with all due respect, your records are fiction. Beautiful, sanitized fiction written by people who needed Operation Nightfall to have a clean ending." She set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, and when she looked up, her entire demeanor had shifted. The broken woman who had stumbled through their gates was gone, replaced by someone who radiated an authority that made the decorated officers in the room feel like raw recruits. "I was never extracted, gentlemen. I was sold. Sold by someone in this very chain of command to the people I had spent 3 years infiltrating. They knew I was coming because someone told them I was coming, and for 18 months they used me as their personal laboratory to test just how much trauma a human mind could endure before it completely shattered." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Harrison could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat beginning to form despite the air conditioning. If what she was saying was true, it meant that Operation Nightfall hadn't just failed, it had been sabotaged from within. It meant there was a traitor somewhere in the military hierarchy, someone with access to the most classified operations in the American intelligence community. But even more terrifying was the implication of her survival. If Sarah Chen had endured 18 months of captivity and torture, if she had somehow escaped and survived 5 years on the streets while maintaining enough operational awareness to find her way back to a military installation, then she wasn't. Just a traumatized veteran seeking help. She was a weapon that had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable suffering, hardened and shaped by experiences that would have destroyed lesser minds. The officers exchanged glances heavy with the weight of a shared and terrible understanding. They weren't conducting a debriefing of a returned asset. They were face to face with someone who had been forged in the fires of their own failures, someone who knew their secrets, their weaknesses, their guilt, and who had just announced her intention to come home. The revelation came not through enhanced interrogation or psychological pressure, but in the quiet moment when Sarah Chen finally smiled. It was the expression that chilled everyone who witnessed it, not because it was cruel or menacing, but because it was genuinely warm, almost maternal, as if she was proud of students who had finally grasped a difficult lesson. "You're wondering about the DNA evidence," she said, addressing the two-way mirror where she knew they were watching. "How someone staged my death so convincingly that even your best forensic analysts believed it. The answer is both simpler and more elegant than you might imagine." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small medical vial, placing it carefully on the metal table. "I staged it myself." The words hit the observation room like a thunderclap. Admiral Stone felt her carefully constructed understanding of the situation crumble like a house of cards. Through the intercom, they heard Sarah continue with the methodical precision of someone delivering a prepared briefing. "Operation Nightfall was never about infiltrating an arms trafficking network, Admiral. It was about identifying the traitor in your command structure. You see, someone had been selling intelligence about our most sensitive operations for years. Operatives were dying, missions were failing, and somehow the enemy always seemed to be one step ahead. So you created a phantom operation, a honey trap designed to flush out the mole." Director Sullivan's secure tablet slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as the full scope of what Sarah was revealing began to dawn on him. She had never been an undercover operative who got in too deep. She had been the bait in an elaborate counterintelligence operation, and she had known it from the beginning. "The beautiful irony," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she shed the last vestiges of her homeless woman disguise, "is that the plan worked. Perfectly. Too perfectly. We identified our traitor within the first 6 months, but when I tried to report in with the intelligence, my extraction was compromised. Someone, and we all know who, had figured out what Operation Nightfall really was, and decided to eliminate the evidence rather than face court-martial." Through the intercom, they could hear her stand and begin pacing the small room with the fluid movements of someone whose body remembered a lifetime of military training. The broken woman who had shuffled through their gates had been another role, another mask in a collection that spanned decades of service. For 18 months, I was their prize. They tortured me not for information about Operation Nightfall. They already knew everything about that because their source had told them. They tortured me because they wanted to understand how American intelligence training actually worked. They wanted to break down my conditioning piece by piece and rebuild me as their asset. And you know what? They very nearly succeeded. "Admiral," Stone activated the intercom with hands that shook despite her best efforts. "Major Chen, who was the traitor? Who sold you out?" The laugh that came through the speakers was like breaking glass. "Admiral, you're asking the wrong question. You're still thinking like this is about one person. One betrayal, one simple answer that will let you restore order to your carefully controlled world. But what if I told you that the traitor has been sitting in your emergency briefings for the past hour? What if I told you that they're listening to this conversation right now, calculating how to minimize the damage to their carefully constructed double life?" The temperature in the observation room seemed to drop 20 degrees, as each officer began studying the others with new eyes. Decades of professional relationships and mutual trust began to deteriorate in real time as the poison of suspicion spread through the group. General Webb's earlier revelation about the false intelligence he had received suddenly took on a more sinister cast. Had he been manipulated, or had he been the manipulator all along? Sarah's voice cut through their growing paranoia like a scalpel. "The beautiful thing about living as a ghost for 5 years is that you learn to see everything from the shadows. You watch, you listen, you learn who visits which off-books accounts in Geneva, who takes vacations that don't match their military salary, who always seems to know just a little bit more than they should about operations they weren't cleared. 5 years is a long time to build a case, Admiral. Long enough to gather evidence that would make even a military tribunal weep." Director Sullivan managed to retrieve his tablet from the floor, his hands shaking as he accessed databases that were theoretically secure from anyone without his level of clearance. What he found there made him question everything he thought he knew about information security. Someone had been accessing files related to dozens of classified operations, leaving digital fingerprints so subtle that they had gone unnoticed for years. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for, a methodical harvesting of intelligence that had been happening under their noses for nearly a decade. "The compound where they held me," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the calm authority of someone who held all the cards, "was a black site funded with American dollars and operated by people who thought they were serving American interests. The man who ran it called himself Colonel Martinez, and he spoke fluent English with a Virginia accent. He knew details about Fort Bragg that aren't in any public record. He knew the names of operations that were classified above my security level. And, most interesting of all, he knew that I was coming to expose him 3 days before my supposed extraction. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with the force of a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about exposing one traitor. It was about revealing an entire network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of American intelligence. Sarah Chen hadn't just survived her ordeal. She had used her time in captivity to gather intelligence on a conspiracy that made her original mission look like a training exercise. As the implications began to sink in, Admiral Stone realized that the woman in Conference Room Delta wasn't seeking justice through proper channels. After 5 years of being officially dead, 5 years of watching her betrayers receive promotions and commendations while she fought for survival on the streets, Sarah Chen had moved beyond the constraints of military justice. She had become something else entirely, judge, jury, and executioner wrapped in the deceptive package of a traumatized veteran seeking help. The most terrifying realization was that her return to Fort Henderson wasn't the end of her plan. It was just the beginning, and somewhere in the room with them, the person responsible for her years of suffering was listening to every word, knowing that their carefully hidden double life was about to be exposed in ways that would make their betrayal of Sarah Chen look like a minor indiscretion. The hunt was about to begin, and for the first time in 5 years, Sarah Chen held all the advantages. The silence in the observation room stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Director Sullivan, would you like to tell them about your house in the Cayman Islands? The one purchased with cryptocurrency transfers that coincidentally occurred within 48 hours of every major intelligence leak over the past 7 years." Director Sullivan's face went through a spectrum of emotions: shock, denial, calculation, and finally, a cold resignation that confirmed everything Sarah had just revealed. The man who had sat quietly in the corner, coordinating with assets across 4 continents, was the spider at the center of a web that had cost dozens of lives and compromised operations worth billions of dollars. "You can't prove anything," Sullivan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You've been on the streets for 5 years, mentally unstable. Even if you had evidence, who would believe the testimony of someone who's been living as a vagrant?" Sarah's smile widened, and for the first time since entering the base, she looked genuinely happy. "Director, you're still thinking like this. Is 2020. You're still thinking like I'm the same broken operative you tried to have eliminated." She reached into her layered clothing and withdrew a device that looked like a modified smartphone. 5 years living invisible gave me something you never had. Time to study my enemy without them knowing I existed." She activated the device, and suddenly the secure monitors throughout the base began displaying a cascade of documents, photographs, and audio recordings that painted a picture of corruption so vast it took everyone's breath away. Bank records, encrypted communications, video surveillance of Sullivan meeting with foreign operatives in cities across 3 continents. 5 years of evidence gathered by someone who had learned to see everything while being seen by no one. "The beautiful thing about being dead," Sarah continued, "is that dead people don't have digital footprints. They don't trigger facial recognition systems. They don't appear on credit reports or housing records. For 5 years, I was a ghost who could go anywhere, see anything, hear everything, while you all believed I was safely buried and forgotten." Admiral Stone stared at the evidence flooding her screens and felt something she hadn't experienced since her academy days, genuine awe at the scope of an operation she hadn't even known was happening. Sarah Chen hadn't just survived her betrayal. She had used her presumed death as the ultimate deep cover, investigating the conspiracy that had destroyed her life while her enemies celebrated their success. "But here's what none of you understand. Yet," Sarah said, and her voice carried a note of something that might have been pity. "I didn't come back for revenge. I came back because there are 12 other operatives currently in deep cover who don't know that their handler has been selling their locations to the highest bidder. 3 of them are scheduled for extraction in the next 6 weeks. Without intervention, they'll walk into the same trap I did." The revelation hit like a physical blow. This wasn't about settling old scores. This was about preventing an ongoing catastrophe. Sarah Chen had returned not as an avenging angel, but as a soldier trying to save lives that were currently in jeopardy. Director Sullivan made his move with the desperate violence of a cornered animal, lunging for the weapon of the nearest security guard. But Sarah had anticipated this moment for 5 years, and what happened next unfolded with the precision of a choreographed dance. Through the observation room speakers they heard a brief struggle, a grunt of pain, and then Sullivan's voice, high and panicked. "You don't understand. They have my daughter. They've had her for 8 years. Everything I did was to keep her alive." The final twist landed like a knife to the heart. Sullivan wasn't just a traitor motivated by greed. He was a father who had been trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between his duty and his child's life. Sarah's voice, when it came through the intercom, carried a gentleness that had been absent throughout the entire confrontation. "I know about Emma, Director. She's safe. She's been safe for 3 months now, living under protective custody with a family in Colorado who think she's their niece visiting for an extended stay. The people who took her are the same ones who tortured me, and they're the same ones whose entire network I've been systematically dismantling for the past 2 years." Through the observation window, they watched Sarah help Sullivan to his feet with the careful tenderness of someone who understood the weight of impossible choices. The man who had betrayed her, who had been responsible for years of suffering, was also a father who had sacrificed everything to protect his child. "The extraction of the 12 operatives begins in 4 hours, Sarah announced to the room. "I have teams in position, extraction routes planned, and enough evidence to prosecute every person involved in this network from the ground level to the very top. But I need this command structure intact and functional to make it work. Director Sullivan will provide testimony and intelligence in exchange for immunity and a reunion with his daughter. General Webb will coordinate the extractions to ensure no one else walks into the trap he unknowingly set for me." Admiral Stone found herself in the surreal position of taking orders from a major who was supposed to be dead, but every instinct she had developed over 30 years of military service told her that Sarah Chen was now the most qualified person in the room to handle the crisis she had uncovered. As the base transformed around them into a coordination center for the most complex extraction operation in modern military history, the officers began to understand the true scope of what they were witnessing. Sarah Chen hadn't just returned from the dead. She had returned as something unprecedented in military history. She was a soldier who had been betrayed by her own system, destroyed by those sworn to protect her, and then reforged in the crucible of abandonment and suffering into something that transcended the traditional boundaries of military service. She was justice wearing the face of mercy, vengeance tempered by understanding, and proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a soldier's arsenal isn't training or equipment or even courage. Sometimes it's the simple refusal to let the people who destroyed you define what you become. As the helicopters began spinning up on the tarmac and communication channels opened to operatives in a dozen countries, Sarah Chen stood at the window of Conference Room Delta, no longer the homeless woman who had walked through their gates, no longer even the decorated major who had been declared dead 5 years ago. She was something new entirely. A guardian angel born from the marriage of betrayal and redemption, ensuring that no soldier would ever again face the darkness alone that she had been forced to navigate. The generals had recognized who she was, but more importantly, she had finally remembered who she had always been meant to become.